Yeah, and so you bring that up. So let's talk about it quick. What do you? I look at the North Korean troops being asked by Putin to join the fight as really a strategic concern and not so much a tactical concern. I mean, if you're talking about losing 1,000 people a day, you've got 10 days worth of North Koreans. Obviously, given if it was a North Korean that died, all North Koreans that died every day, obviously, but just do the math. It really doesn't help. So is it a practice run in a sense? Is it a way to develop how you could backfill Russian soldiers with future North Koreans going forward? I mean, how do you see that?
I agree with you. And to go back to your episode 34, which I thought was awesome, tactically, no change, right? No impact. Like you said, it's 11 battalions. I mean, it does keep him from having to pull other Russian soldiers out of the line of contact to try to take back Kursk, right? But at the end of the day, we've seen in the news, Russians were like, hey, they didn't bring ammo. That creates other problems. They were complaining because it's taking 3 senior Russian leaders to every 30 Korean troops. So that's also, they're already losing leaders. So that's another friction point that it's creating. If you think of the tactical, it's almost creating more problems. And then we haven't even asked or looked at kind of, okay, how are they communicating, interpreter wise? So there, it just brings up tactically a lot more issues. At the operational and strategic level, though, to your point, the strategic level, or maybe operational level, I think that Putin is trying to do everything he can to avoid calling a second mobilization. So this might be a little bit a part of that, right? Not like we said, it's not that much combat power, but the strategic ramifications are huge. Now he's invited non-NATO partners or he's invited other parties. He's invited other sovereign states into the conflict, right? And so what's preventing us from inviting, non-NATO partners into the conflict? The NAC actually released a statement on the 8th, kind of condemning the action, talking about how it violates several UN resolutions, but also who endorsed that comment was Australia, Japan, South Korea. So what's preventing us from doing that? And probably, it all has to do with messaging. No matter what we do, Russia's going to say we're, NATO and the West are aggressing against him. But it does open the door for a lot of unilateral action and potential escalation of the conflict, for sure. South Korea, like we talked about, he's said, we want to send troops and observers to watch what the North Koreans are doing. I think that could just compound very quickly into a lot of negative actions for the Europe and the Pacific. So
yeah, and I thought it was so weird when I was just thinking about it the other day. I'm like, there's a frozen conflict on the Korean Peninsula that's been there since 1953, and now it could potentially warm in Russia. Right, versus the South Koreans could potentially be ended up fighting against North Koreans in a conflict that's not really theirs. Right, I mean, what does North Korea really benefit from a geostrategic standpoint by fighting in Russia, other than getting some of the things back from Putin that they want, like training and potentially some nuclear capability, at least not capability, but nuclear education. So this is such an interesting development because here we have North Koreans entering the fight in Russia, and then potentially, given some of the rhetoric coming out of South Korea, that they might want to get involved. Now, I'm not saying they're necessarily going to enter the fight, but they did talk about potentially sending weapons, and so now you have this frozen conflict that's been around since 1953, now kind of thawing a little bit, if you will, potentially in Russia versus with Ukraine being there, and North Korea, I can see getting some strategic benefit. It looks like that Putin is giving them some food in exchange for their service. The North Koreans are obviously providing a lot of ammunition, 152 rounds, which by the way are not working all that well, which is another whole discussion, and potentially they're going to get some combat experience, something that they haven't had obviously since the early 50s in any real sense. So they can pass that back off to their leadership back in North Korea and get some experience on the ground. So they'll test some TTPs and other things like that. I just don't think it's going to change anything. Like you had said on the battle space, it's really more of a strategic concern.
Yeah, and that operational impact of Putin not having to pull soldiers out of the line of contact, he can keep them in Ukraine. But it's going to be really, I mean, although he does, they do a good job of controlling the media, for their country. Like, how is he justifying Kursk? How is he justifying still having Ukrainians in Russia? Right? I don't have an answer to that question. But maybe it helps. Like, look, I'm doing something about it, or it's very. I think a lot of people who study history are very concerned about now. There's new variables to this math problem. And, who's going to decide to take advantage of what, right? Like people who are not in NATO, countries who are not in NATO, could just choose to do whatever they wanted unilaterally, and they don't even really have to talk to us about it. I don't think that anybody would do that, but it could go. These variables could play out in very escalating ways. Or, on the other side, it's like, okay, Putin really has to think very carefully about how he escalates with NATO now, because he's not just dragging him into